My golden brother made me explode. I got kicked out of the house on my birthday. Growing up, my brother was always the golden child. My parents gave him everything while giving me nothing, allowing him to treat me as trash. He acquired a superiority complex, and my extended family exposed my parents' favoritism. In retaliation, my parents relocated us far away so that no one could tell them anything. The favoritism became extreme, with all of my things coming from charity shops and my brother practically wearing designer. At 17, I dated a girl, and he was so creepy to her that she dumped me. Then came my canon event. My parents celebrated my 18th birthday with my brother while I was instructed to stay at home. I received one present, which was my father's old raggedy polo shirt. This was my last straw. I went off on them in a horrible way, releasing everything I'd been suppressing for years. I called my extended relatives for assistance, and my mother took my phone. "If you don't like it here, then get out," she yelled and kicked me out. That night, I became homeless, and unbeknownst to my parents, this was the beginning of the end of their lives. I couldn't finish the narrative here, but you may find it on my channel, which is linked below. I struggled for years to change my life, and when I did, they returned to try to take everything from me. I had just turned 18 and hadn't finished high school when my parents and golden child brother kicked me out of the house. I wasn't mad though. Couch surfing was a lot better than living with them. I didn't even attend my high school graduation. Unfortunately, life was really difficult for a while. Being homeless makes it extremely difficult to get and hold a job, and without one, finding a place to live is as tough. My parents never contacted me once. There were times when I wanted to beg their forgiveness, but I managed to resist. Years later, thankfully, I landed a retail job and worked my tail off to be able to rent a condominium. Life was on the upward for a few years, and while I couldn't save much, I did have my own place. Granted, I rented with someone, but it was preferable to being homeless. Then life shattered again. The onset of the 2020 pandemic was not kind to me at all, and all I had worked for appeared to evaporate into thin air. I lost my work and was unable to extend my apartment lease since my roommate had also lost his job, and neither of us could afford the property with unemployment money. As the lease expired, my flatmate departed early to go back in with relatives, and I had to sell practically all of my belongings since I would be homeless if I didn't downsize drastically. Fortunately, I had a plan. Years ago, I purchased a vehicle just because I have always enjoyed trucks. So I got a $1,000 camper in decent condition and mounted it on my vehicle so I could live in it for a bit. It was meant to be temporary, but I ended up staying there for longer than I expected. I was hoping to be able to live out of the camper at my parents' house, where my brother and his family also dwell. I swallowed my pride and asked if I could stay in the camper next to their house, but they said they had a full house and didn't want me there. They stated they'd only let me park my camper there if I paid them about what it would cost to rent an apartment in my neighborhood. That was far too much just to park my camper. I was unemployed and attempting to save as much of my unemployment benefits as I could until I could find a new job. With the rent they were asking, I could have easily lived in a flat. My parents labeled my camper an eyesore and instructed me to take a walk because we couldn't agree. My sister-in-law, brother's wife, found it humorous that I had to live in a camper. My brother joined her in pointing at and insulting me, referring to me as a homeless bum. After my parents said no, I parked my vehicle and camper in a store parking lot to sleep. On the first night when I had nowhere else to go, I was terrified that someone might break in. Needless to say, I did not sleep well that night. I had nowhere else to go because any other family who owned houses were rather far away, and all of my pals were in apartments. I was also really tied to my surroundings, so I didn't want to just leave. I'd also had my mail forwarded to a friend's place, which was the only way I could still receive it. Finding a safe area to park was tough. I began seeking for a job similar to my old one. It takes months to live the nomadic camper life. During that time, I had to deal with a variety of situations, from beggars and addicts to individuals asking that I leave because my camper was an eyesore. Someone who instructed me to move claimed to be part of a HOA. I wasn't even parked on a street with residences, and when I asked about the HOA, they were really angry and threatened me. I moved my camper nevertheless to avoid the problem. To ensure a consistent source of electricity, I learned to plug in a lengthy extension cord anywhere I could to recharge my camper batteries. This entailed sneaking around and putting it into an exterior outlet of a random building while parked on the street. I realize it's a bad thing to do, but I needed to keep my batteries charged so my refrigerator stayed cool. I had a small solar power bank for charging my phone, but I didn't have a generator, which is noisy and requires fuel. So I did what I needed to do. After months of living like this, I eventually found a new job. I had to relocate to a neighboring city to find work that did not entail shopping. I worked in retail during college and swore myself I'd never do it again, but I was almost ready to break that pledge. I was still receiving unemployment benefits, but I didn't have a secure place to live and didn't want to be jobless when they ran out. Plus, I was completely bored. I had little else to do than read, view movies on a little portable DVD player, use my phone or laptop, and keep track of where I might park and use the local public restrooms. I kind of envy the Japanese since they have public bathhouses. We could definitely use something like that around here. When I finally got a new job, I basically lived in the back lot of the building near the warehouse, in old employee parking spaces that no one else seemed to use because they were so far back. The place was nearly forgotten. My boss, the firm owner, actually preferred this arrangement because I was willing to work any shift I could get as long as I got enough sleep. He even let me remove the camper from my truck and park it in one of the slots so I could drive around without it. I'm not sure if this was legal, but no one harassed us about it the entire time I lived there. I didn't have to deal with many trespassers. There were a few, but the security personnel led them away. I was almost always available when they needed me and worked nearly every day of the week. My supervisor allowed me to hook my camper into the building for electricity and water, and I paid a small portion of the rent by working for free on Sundays when no one else was present but the caretaker and security guard. Aside from that, I generally had to shower at a friend's flat or at my local gym because the camper had no shower, only a portable toilet, and I didn't want to fill it because emptying it is a dreaded duty, so I used other facilities whenever possible. I had a key to the warehouse and could use the bathroom at any time. I even knew the night security man by his first name. He's subsequently become one of my closest buddies. The camper was simple to heat in the winter with a little electric heater. Summers were not enjoyable though. The camper lacked air conditioning, so I had to buy a used portable air conditioner to make it bearable. I got a lot of overtime pay and learned some new skills from other employees. Eventually, midway through this year, I secured a better position in the company as a supervisor and began earning a higher pay than my previous employment. That's when I decided I wanted a home. A scare from losing my condo made me realize I needed something more stable in the long run. I shopped about for something close to work and found a 3-bedroom mobile home on a small acreage barely 2 miles away, but I was able to purchase it for $10,000 less than the asking price. I used virtually all of my savings for a down payment and was approved for a home loan. I didn't have to live in a camper any longer. There was enough space behind the house for me to pull my truck in and remove the camper to set it up in the backyard, so I left it there as its own little building in case I needed it again. I was completely settled in the house. I was dumb enough to brag about it in my book of faces. My family noticed the post, and that's where the real trouble began. After a few weeks, my parents and brother, along with his family, paid me a surprise visit to show me around my house. I did not even give them my address. I am still not sure how they found out where I reside. None of my pals have confessed, and no family members have previously visited me, so I'm wondering if they trailed me at work, followed me home or whatever. It would really not surprise me. When I opened the door, they virtually all pushed their way in like boisterous travelers and immediately began making themselves at home. They all continued to poke around, and my sister-in-law flashed me a weird smirk. It was only afterward that I realized why. My relatives had unexpectedly paid me a visit, and their reason enraged me like a bull on steroids who had just been stung by a hornet. My parents were continually commenting on how much additional space I now have, which is excessive for someone like me who does not have a wife or children. And my brother kept observing that my house had more space than our parents, and that it was also closer to his employment. I am aware that there are red flags all around. Eventually, my brother requested me to speak alone. Everyone else abruptly left the room and piled onto the front porch. That's when I realized they had a plan. My brother, Dan, told me the house was too much for me to handle alone and that I should let him move in with his family because his wife is expecting their 4th child and my house is much closer to his employment. He pointed out that I already had the camper, so I could live outside while they stayed in the main house. I would like to remind out that Dan never mentioned offering rent. Mind you, he has a nice job. He also mentioned that there will be adjustments, including curfews, and that I would not be able to walk in at any time without prior warning. If it wasn't my brother, I'd assume the person I was speaking with was insane, but Dan lost his marbles long ago as a result of our parents treating him as if he were the center of the universe. I tried to speak, but he kept talking over me as if I had no say in the situation. There was no way I was going to rent out my house or sections of it to him. Other people, perhaps, simply so I can pay off my mortgage more easily, but not him or his ugly wife. This type of incident has been described in numerous web videos. I never imagined I'd actually live it since it seems so ridiculous. However, my dad, brother and sister-in-law all meet the description of a bunch of egotistical, entitled freaks, so I grabbed up my phone, set it to record, and just held onto it. Dan didn't appear to care or realize that I'd done this, instead sitting there with his arms waving around and talking about all the reasons he wanted my house. Then he moved from saying that to acting as if it were a done deal and reaching out to shake my hand. That's when I finally showed my backbone and yelled hell no, loudly enough to make Dan stumble backward for a second. I had rarely raised my voice to him at that level since I was chastised by our parents if I did. But it was my house, not theirs. My spine can shine as much as it wants here. I stood up and told him that my house was not for sale, and acting as if I would let him move in just because he wanted to won't make it happen. I bought my house for myself, and it's not my responsibility that he keeps having children and staying with our parents because he can't afford to move out. Dan got as close to me as he could without touching me, telling me that I didn't deserve the house. He needed a better place for his family to stay. I laughed in his face and told him that was complete bullshit because I worked hard to get my house. Of course, I earned it. Dan began ranting that I don't have a wife or children and don't need all the room, so I might as well give it to him. I told him I wouldn't give him anything, and he never offered to pay my rent if I let them move in. Even if I couldn't live in my own house, I'd still have to pay the entire mortgage. Dan then informed me that he shouldn't have to pay rent because his family comes first, and our parents assured me that I would do this and that. I yelled as if their word were law, telling Dan that they lacked the authority or capacity to give him my house. My parents and sister-in-law barged back in through the front door and encircled me, attempting to compel me to comply. There was a lot of fighting, but from this point forward, I heard the phrase "just do it for Dan" more than I can remember. During the fight, I told them all that they had no say in my life or my house and should leave before I contacted the cops. Sister-in-law yelled the most at me, saying she was pregnant again and I couldn't do this to her. I told her I had done nothing to her. She just felt she could take from me as if I would simply allow it. I had no obligations to her or her family. Then I called her a stuck-up bitch who never showed me any respect. So I don't care what she thinks or how many children she has. I have no pity for her. She will not be living at my house. Well, that enraged her enough to assault me. My brother kicked and screamed as he held her back. She kept demanding that he let her go. The phone I was carrying captured almost everything, so I held it up and threatened to call the police if they didn't leave right away. My parents informed Dan that they were leaving. Then my mother told me I had a week to come to my senses. I told her I wouldn't be there and not to return. When I warned my sister-in-law that my phone filmed everything and that if she tried anything I would seek charges for assault, she shouted at me and went out, crying loudly with her face in her hands. My mother was the last one out the door, and she told me that I needed to do this for Dan and my sister-in-law. I responded by saying I wouldn't be there. After kicking out my parents, brother and sister-in-law for attempting to force me to hand over my new house to my brother, I immediately took to social media to tell the entire family the story. It spread quickly, but you won't find it anymore because it was all erased some time ago and I made my own profile private. I posted about it because I knew the first thing my family would do when they got home was try to alter the events to make me the villain. And I was precisely correct. But I had about an hour to get started before they arrived, and I had video evidence to back up my claim about what they had done. Being proactive paid off since I quickly gained support from a large number of family members. My parents, brother, and sister-in-law may have been preparing to compose their own posts, but it was too late, so they didn't bother attempting to deceive my dad, Dan, and sister-in-law had a few flying monkeys to help them, but not much else. Many others already knew how entitled they were, so what happened was easily understood and accepted. There was one particular person who called me. I'm not sure who they were, but they yelled at me that I was a terrible brother who needed to make way for a proper family man. I simply ended the conversation and blocked the number. This was not a rerun. After a week, my parents showed up with Dan on my front porch, just as they had promised in their previous ultimatum. They rang my doorbell repeatedly and hammered on the door until I replied. I opened it just a crack, and they tried to push their way back in, but I'd added a couple of latch chains to block it, and I even held myself against the door for good measure. My father and brother begged me to allow them in, but I refused, saying I was filming everything and would call the cops if they tried to break in again. My mother soothed them and then, in her sickly sweet tone, asked whether I was ready to let my brother move in. I told her and the rest of them to F off and never return. My mother cried crocodile tears and asked why I couldn't just do this for Dan, my loving brother. I chuckled and openly stated that I do not love him as a brother because he treated me poorly for years, and they merely encouraged him to do so. They are bad parents, and he's an awful brother. Then I ordered them to leave or I'd contact the cops right away. They all went remarkably quickly, save for my mother's loud wailing and the others' ugly looks. One could argue that making them leave was disturbingly simple. I thought the whole thing was over, but maybe I should have taken them more seriously because they had other ridiculous intentions. I returned home later that week, on Friday evening, to discover a moving truck and my brother's minivan parked in my driveway. Dan and his family were moving in. When I spotted him, he just waved and gave me a crap-eating grin. I was infuriated. I told him and the rest of his family to stop, but his sister-in-law smugly informed me that whether I liked it or not, they were moving in. Then, while dipping her head and puckering her lips, she stated it was fine because my mother had approved it and that I should always listen to what my mother says. Hearing those remarks and seeing her smug expression made me seethe with wrath, so I locked myself in my truck and called the cops right immediately. When they realized what I was doing, my sister-in-law began hammering on my window and screamed at me to stop, saying that I couldn't do this to her since she and Dan needed the house. She wailed, "Why can't you just do this for Dan?" I said, "Screw Dan, it's my damn house, not his." Then she threatened to key the side of my truck unless I stopped contacting the police, which the 911 operator overheard due to the window being slightly open. I told my sister-in-law that if she wrecked my truck, I would sue her, and she was clever enough to back down. When the cops arrived, Dan and his sister-in-law, together with their children, had barricaded themselves in my home. I informed the cops what had transpired and showed them my new driver's license, which included my current address. Then when we got to my front door, I noticed that they had changed the lock, and the old lock was lying on the porch with the center drilled out. The drill they used was right next to it, along with a full Harbor Freight drill bit set. Could they have been any more dumb to leave evidence out like that? I pointed out the damaged lock and drill, then gave the cops a recap of what had happened before. Dan must have phoned our parents over after I returned home, because they arrived while I was speaking with the cops. My parents instantly lied, claiming that I had agreed to rent my house to my brother and his family. I stated that it was an easily proven untruth in one form or another. So Dan and my sister-in-law finally emerged from my house with some paperwork in hand. They both looked pleased, as if they had outsmarted me. They had actually created and printed a fictitious leasing agreement. My signature was not on it. There was one, but it didn't look like my handwriting. I don't think any of them have ever seen my signature. Thus that was extremely stupid of them. I informed my dad and Dan that it was clear fraud, and if the cops investigated, they'd easily figure it out, and I don't think going to jail or court would help them. It could possibly cost Dan his work, which is his only source of income for his family. I also promised to hire a lawyer and seek for damages if anything of mine was lost, stolen, or broken. Dan turned white and looked terrified when I repeated all of it, but my mother intervened, insisting that I just do this for Dan and live in the blasted camper, so they could finally have a family home to themselves. I exclaimed at her that if she thought it was such a great idea, she could do it herself and give Dan her house instead. My mother and I were separated by cops, and I told them that if they didn't leave right away, I would file charges. I shouted about how they hammered out the latch on my front door to break in. The lease documents were blatant forgeries. They poorly copied my signature, and I have footage of my sister-in-law assaulting me. Those are felonies that I could use to ruin their lives, and if they didn't leave, I would. The only reason I hadn't done it sooner was for Dan's children. They just have one chance to get out. When my parents heard that, I believe they realized they couldn't force me to do it for Dan. My mother succumbed and stated that she would put an end to this. Then she approached her sister-in-law and spoke quietly with her for a minute while my father spoke to Dan. Sister-in-law immediately began crying and shredding up the phony rental papers into little parts and flinging them like confetti, only to have an officer order them to pick up the pieces of paper or he would fine them for littering. At this moment, both cops got the "I don't get paid enough for this" expression on their faces. Dan had to start asking his children to pack their belongings back into the moving truck. The kids were all crying, with the eldest sobbing because he wouldn't get his own room now. Sister-in-law and Dan collected their children in one final desperate attempt to shame me with the sad family routine. You know how they all come together in a sort of group hug, all looking the same direction. I swear, I believe they practiced it beforehand. All of the kids had the same begging expressions and quivering mouths. Sister-in-law continued caressing her pregnant belly and drooping her head to look like a sad puppy, and my brother simply made the saddest face he could and pleaded, "Please don't do this. We should be allowed to live here." But I didn't hesitate and instructed them to continue packing. The children and sister-in-law all burst into tears. Dan roared at me, "Are you content with yourself? You've denied us a house because you're too selfish to share and support your family." I ended up laughing like a lunatic and retorting that all he was attempting to do was take, not share. And no amount of tears will make me let his family move in since he is no longer my brother. He's just an entitled eye-hole who believes he can take anything from me, just like when we were kids. Dan began F-bombing me until the cops warned him to stop or he'd be handcuffed, regardless of whether I wanted to press charges. He sucked in his lips, his expression a mixture of fear and rage. I asked the cops if they could stay until my parents, brother and sister-in-law had departed, and they stated they wouldn't leave until this was handled. In fact, 2 cops turned into 4 in the next few minutes as more cars arrived. For whatever reason, this gave my parents an extra push to get started. I insisted Dan give me the keys to the new lock he installed on my front door. He was quite reluctant to hand them over. Then, instead of handing them to me, he flung them down the street and into a storm drain, telling me to go get them myself. But one of the cops chastised him for it and ordered him to go collect them. He had to remove the grate off to get to them, and he got somewhat dirty in the process. When he got the keys back, he snarled and slammed them down in my hand. I then told everyone to go and never come back. My mother stated I'd be disowned for this, as if it was a threat to me, and I expressed it to them. Then, in an extremely sarcastic tone, I remarked something like, "Oh no, that means I won't be able to attend any of your holidays, where I'm always treated poorly because Dan has always been your apparent favorite. You treated me so terribly growing up that if Dan ever needed an organ donor, I'd show up at the hospital to mock him. So do what you always taught me to do when I was mistreated by all of you. Suck it up." My folks were astounded when I mentioned all of that. The 4 of cops also gave them a scornful look. I tell you, if you want to put terrible parents like mine on the spot, confront them in front of cops because they are unlikely to do something dumb. Then my mother began crying and walking away. My father just stood there, as if he wanted to put hands on me. Dan just held his children in defeat. Oh, and my sister-in-law was having a tantrum on my front lawn. They eventually formed a queue, handed out boxes and left my residence. Nothing had been unpacked yet, so everything was pulled out immediately. But as I was doing it, my mother continued telling me that it wasn't too late and that I could still do it for Dan, each time attempting to negotiate more and more in order to get me to reconsider. She said Dan could pay the rent if I let them stay. When that didn't work, she suggested I move back in with them and let Dan let my house so I wouldn't have to share the building. I told her to shut up and continue packing boxes because I don't want Dan or his family around. I don't want his money, and I never want to live with him or my parents again after how they treated me as a child. Making a deal with my parents would be like making one with the devil. After hearing that, my sister-in-law threw another tantrum, tossed a box down, and sat on the ground to have a pity party since she didn't want to move back into the house with my parents. She just sat there, angry and heartbroken, until everyone else had done. She didn't want to get up when it was time to go. They finally got everything out of the house and into the truck, so before they left, I scolded my parents one last time for everything they had put me through growing up. And with 4 cops right there, they couldn't do much more than stand there and take it for once. I called them out on a number of things that occurred. I even complained that they couldn't do something kind for me, like let me stay over with my camper when I was homeless and trying to get back on my feet. How they let Dan and my sister-in-law mock and label me a bum. So who is the bum now? They wanted to push me out of my house so Dan could stay for free. However, when I needed a place to stay, they wanted to charge me more than I could afford simply to park my camper because they knew I was out of work. When I told them all of it, the cops gave me even more scornful looks. So I put my parents on the spot once more, asking them what I had done, aside from being born, to deserve to be treated so poorly. Because when I finally achieve any success in life, they want to take it away from me for their favorite child. Because they preferred that I give everything to Dan and keep nothing for myself, I purchased my house with the money I earned. I owe them nothing, and I will never ask for anything from them again because, clearly, they see me as nothing more than a doormat or a cash cow. I received no responses from them. They just stood there like fish out of water, so I kept yelling and asking them what in God's name made them believe they were such good parents. After all of that, my father was flushed, but more from shame than anger this time. My mother was crying, saying she was a terrible person. I openly agreed that she is a terrible person. They're all guilty, and I'm sure they'll suffer the consequences. They were bad people, and everyone knew it. If I'd called them out on all of this in private rather than in public, they would have just gotten angry and continued to act as if I was in the wrong. They simply maintained the denial for so long that it became ingrained in their personality. My mother buried her face in my father's jacket, crying, and my father appeared more defeated than I had ever seen him. Dan and his family avoided me completely as they finished packing everything back into the moving truck. I made certain that nothing of mine was stolen, despite the fact that I hadn't had much time to acquire any furnishing. They all got back in their cars, and my sister-in-law just stayed there glaring at me with hate until my brother convinced her to drive the minivan home. And as soon as they were gone, I rushed back online and told everyone what had happened. My parents were too humiliated to try to defend their behavior this time, and while the family was already divided before the episode, it was now a landslide in my favor. After this episode, nearly everyone in the family has sided with me, and those who haven't are just refusing to side with anyone. No matter how many times my parents attempted the "we did it for Dan" excuse, no one listened anymore. As a result, they no longer have any familial support. Many family members who I expected to oppose me did. That includes the previously flying monkeys, so I suppose they've had enough. Around that time, I offered to entertain half of the family for Christmas Eve at my new home. My folks weren't invited. Surprisingly, I was not blocked on my brother and sister-in-law's profiles, and I learned that sister-in-law delivered her fourth child in early November. They still live with my parents. I'm quite sure they knew I was watching because my sister-in-law continued making passive-aggressive remarks every couple of weeks about not having enough space while living with my parents, probably to test if she can still make me feel guilty. I'm sure it's driving my mother and father insane because they can't have any peace and quiet in their old age with 3 young children, a mentally unstable sister-in-law, my golden child brother and a newborn baby in the house at the same time. Perhaps they could relocate into a camper in their own backyard and let Dan take over their entire house. They could find some serenity then. Yes, they could do that for Dan.